And next is Dr. Sally Burt. I invite Dr. Sally Burt for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. So thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to talk about Australia and its relations with the region and China's influence in Australia. And so firstly, what I'm going to cover is the factors that influence Australia's relationship with the region. And so there are some key and unique factors that determine how Australia sees itself in the region and interacts with it. I then want to explore some of China's influence in Australia, particularly looking at infrastructure deals that China has made with different states, bypassing the federal government and how that's occurred and why, and China's influence through the Confucius Institutes. And then I want to explore some of Australia's response, which comes in three key elements: through national security legislation and changes to the national security understanding in Australia, re-engagement with the Quad, and the new AUKUS partnership that was announced and what those different elements and responses entail. Then I want to explore some public opinion in Australia and the shifts that have happened in recent years and the impact that that's had, and then hopefully some conclusions and insights into future. But firstly, to understand Australia's context of the region, we need to understand how Australia sees itself in the region. And so that perspective comes from, firstly, our history, Australia's history and its culture, which is British and heavily influenced by the alliance, long-time alliance with the US. And so Australia sees itself very much as a Western country and has that culture, but doesn't sit well geographically in that. And geographically, Australia is Asian and fits into that economic relationship and commercial relationships with the region. And that really creates that identity crisis for Australia of being Western, but not really Western, and having to function within Asia. The second factor that influences Australia's kind of context in the region are the political parties that are in power. So the Labor Party, or the ALP, is the left in the Australian political system, and it has a very different approach to the Liberal Party, which is the right-wing party. So the ALP is generally more sympathetic to China and supports China and Asian literacy, whereas the Liberal Party is much more cautious about the China threat and is fearful of that. The third factor that swings Australia's, how it sees itself in the region and the context, is public opinion and whether that is favourable to China or the US, and that swings, as do the other two. So, you know, basically Australia can alternate in this identity crisis of how it sees itself in the region. So if that's how Australia's approach to the region, how does China deal with Australia? Firstly, the infrastructure funding is an area of influence for China in Australia. In a familiar model in the region, Australia succumbed to some infrastructure funding from China through, firstly, the Port of Darwin lease. So in 2015, under Adam Giles, who was the Northern Territory Chief Minister at the time, he was a member of the Liberal Party, entered into a 99-year lease with the Lambridge Group, which was a company headquartered in China. And the Lambridge Group paid $506 million for a 99-year lease of the port. How was that allowed to happen? How was this key piece of infrastructure allowed to be funded by China? It was basically a dispute between the Northern Territory wanting funding from the federal government and the federal government not wanting to supply that funding, which opened the door for China and foreign investment, which is where the Northern Territory sought its funding because it wanted a port that created it as a gateway to Asia, and it wanted to be able to have top class facilities, and if the federal government wasn't willing to fund that, then it sought foreign funding for it. And China stepped up to the plate. Victoria was another state that succumbed to these kind of infrastructure deals. And so the Victorian government under Daniel Andrews, who was the Premier in 2017, he attended a summit in Beijing that was focused on the Belt and Road Initiative and signed a memorandum of understanding along with 100 other countries and parties to the MOU, but it was signed and it was about cooperating. Victoria would cooperate with the CCP in its Belt and Road Initiative. It was a pretty vague memorandum of understanding. There were no specific kind of commitments made. It was just for general cooperation, but ultimately there must have been some projects in the pipelines and some thinking underway, and problematically, and you can read into this what you will, the Victorian ports were going to be an area of, or have been a long-standing area of problem for the Victorian government. And so whether that was something that was in mind, we don't know. But again, the federal government was bypassed. So in both these deals, the federal government was not consulted or was not the party to the agreement with the foreign state. And so particularly in the Port of Darwin deal, some federal ministers made positive comments about it. So whether that would have altered anything is anybody's guess. But in retrospect, they're keen to distance themselves from those deals, the federal government. The other area where China is seeking influence in Australia is through the education facilities and the education infrastructure through Confucius Institutes, which are joint ventures between Chinese universities and universities from other countries. And Australia has some Confucius Institutes. So the aim of them is to expand Chinese soft power by teaching Mandarin and Chinese culture and creating exchange between scholars and students of these different countries and expanding the understanding of China. In 2016, there were 512 Confucius Institutes in 130 countries. Australia had about 8 or 9. So there were 8 or 9 universities that had done these partnerships with Chinese universities. The two possible threats that these present to educational institutions is firstly through academic freedom. When there's funding from a donor country, obviously the independence of the educational activities being undertaken come into question, and the independence of that. And obviously there is a national security risk when there's foreign access to key educational infrastructure and the education of an elite in a country, as well as access to information and data through research and the research connections. The issue for Australia, again, was, as with the other infrastructure deals, Australian universities were very susceptible to funding and seeking funding from external sources, saying that the federal government had underfunded universities, particularly in the area of research. And so there was gaps there for China to exploit in terms of finding alternative sets of funding. And the other area where universities seek funding generally to cover costs is through international students, which again poses problems. So what was Australia's response to these Chinese areas of Chinese influence and infiltration? The Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation basically put out warnings about managing critical infrastructure and having risks of foreign powers involved in that. So along with the Port of Darwin deal and the Victorian Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative, there were a lot of politicians that were doing deals and developing close friendships with Chinese officials that were becoming very concerning in the late 2010s. And so in 2019, the government created a counter foreign intelligence task force, and a coordinator was appointed the year before. So a task force was created to deal with this foreign interference. One of their key roles of the task force was about updating national security legislation to create new laws and update definitions of national security. And so the critical infrastructure identified in that were gas, water and electricity, as well as cyber and ports. But then added to that through these amendments were education services and financial services. So they were added to the national security definition, or areas of critical national infrastructure. So it was clear that universities were a kind of, and the Confucius Institutes were in view when these changes were made to the law. It led to the development of guidelines for universities to deal with countering foreign interference in universities. And it helps the government to get involved and monitor and ensure that universities are complying with different controls to limit and monitor foreign interference. In 2020, there was also some laws passed that gave the federal government power to veto foreign deals with states. And control foreign, because the federal government sees control of foreign affairs, it was sort of reasserting itself in that space and stopping state governments being able to make these deals with foreign powers without any consultation with the federal government. That was obviously targeted at the Victorian deal in the first place, and so the Victorian MOU with the CCP was cancelled, as was another deal with China, and so that China didn't look like it was the only country being targeted. There was also a deal with Iran and a deal with Syria that were also cancelled by the federal government that Victorian had entered into. There's also been calls for the Port of Darwin deal to be cancelled and revoked, but obviously there's a bit more complexity to that in that there would have to be compensation made to the Landbridge Group, which would be problematic. And there's also recently been a decision by the Department of Defence that there are no national security grounds to cancel that lease, which makes it very problematic if the National Cabinet does want to cancel that from here. China was also not very happy about the Victorian MOU being cancelled, and there were political and trade repercussions that came from that, and whether the government sees that there will be larger ones from the Port of Darwin being cancelled, time will tell. The Australian government has also made more general responses to deal with China's rise in the region. And firstly, that's through re-engagement with the quadrilateral powers. In 2007, Australia withdrew from the Quad because Kevin Rudd was in power. He was Prime Minister, and he was very focused on increasing Australia's Asian literacy and wanted a good relationship with China, and followed that pattern of the ALP being much more sympathetic to China. The withdrawal from the Quad caused ructions in the region and consternation. And not because of that, but because of things that have happened in the interim. In 2018, as Prime Minister, Scott Morrison of the Liberal Party took a renewed interest in the Quad and re-engaged with that group. And then Australia obviously attended the summit in 2021, along with the other Quad powers that was held in the US. That summit identified some really key issues for focus, one being critical infrastructure funding and ensuring that there's no gap in that critical infrastructure funding that China can exploit. Cooperation on cyber and other technology issues, and ensuring that there's technology infrastructure around these countries so that they can all take advantage of advances in that area. And there was, importantly, educational cooperation deals announced, including scholarships for students studying STEM and basically cultural and research exchanges between the countries, which are all seen as very important. So you can see the focus there being really around where Australia has seen its problematic issues with Chinese influence. Another area of or response that Australia has taken is to draw itself closer to its long-standing allies, the US.
Dr. Burt, you have 2 more minutes.
Perfect. So it's drawn closer to the US and the UK through the new AUKUS partnership, which was recently announced. And that's been a response to the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which identified competition between the US and China is increasing, and China is developing military and cyber capabilities as a threat much faster than Australia first anticipated. So the AUKUS partnership's focused on stable, a secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific region, which obviously works for Australia, but it also gives Australia access to military and naval capabilities, which will be hugely important in terms of the nuclear-powered submarine technology that the US holds. And so that allows Australia to operate in contested areas. This comes from the media announcement, contested areas with lower risk of detection. So obviously the South China Sea is a clear target of that. There are some problems that this raises for Australia's national security, in that it had to cancel a deal with the French for a diesel submarine, which caused consternation, and we're yet to see the full anger from the Chinese. Just quickly, this has been a response to Australia's shift in public opinion since 2017. So there's been a very big decline in Australia's positive sentiment about China. It's beginning to be obvious that concerns about China's growth are outweighing people's optimism, and investments are seen as a real concern and need to be addressed. There's also issues around bullying over trade retaliation for Australia's call in April 2020 for an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also concerns about the influence in Australian politics, and as the greater threat of conflict between the US and China over Taiwan increases, Australia becomes a bit more nervous. Although Australia, if you ask the Australian public, the majority would like us to remain neutral in that conflict. So basically, the other side to it is that Australian opinion of different Quad countries is actually increasing, and so there's an increasing trust among those partners, which is good. So in conclusion, basically, Australia's had a long-held identity crisis that's seen it sway between the US and the UK and China over time, but it's currently very clear that Australia is leaning westward rather than north. And so China's move to expand its soft power in the region have backfired in Australia, and it's turned Australian public opinion against China. China was able to find some key areas of vulnerability through economic investment in infrastructure and educational areas that it's exploited. That's led the Australian government to make a new threat assessment and is now targeting China. And so policymakers have turned towards the Quad and AUKUS to increase security, and the cost of those decisions is yet to be fully realised, but it's clear now that the public and that both political parties are willing to bear that pain in the short term for the longer term gain of longer term national security. And so that looks good for Australia's involvement in the region and friendship with India. And on that note, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sally Butt, for her wonderful presentation with regard to the Australian relationship with China, which is very much problematic. Especially after the arrival of the pandemic, and the relationship between China and Australia became problematic, especially after the arrival of Scott Morrison as the Prime Minister. That relation worsened with the result of the AUKUS agreement again. And know that the problem of trade, coal, import of coal, and all these things are there. And Australia is one of the important member in the politics of American politics of countering China's rise in this particular region. And recently, America and United Kingdom helped China by offering them a kind of nuclear submarine to prevent the Chinese activities, especially in the South China Sea and in the Pacific region. And this is an important relation, and we are watching very curiously how this is going to develop, because the trade between China and Australia is very important, and how can they find an alternative for their coal import and etc. And this is very tricky relation. And thank you, Dr. Sally Butt, for your wonderful presentation. And